Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. I'm assisted tonight by my colleague Susan Eastland. She's also on the programming team. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the Cary Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like today's event to you. This program is in partnership with the Lexington High School PTO and support from IAL, CAL, and the school committee. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and we will bring a microphone over to you. If you are joining us online, please put your questions into the Q&A and we will answer all the questions at the end. Maximus Book Center is here tonight. For those who are interested in purchasing a copy of the book, our author will also be able to sign them after the program. Tonight we will meet author Natasha Warikoo, who will be in conversation with our moderators, Christina Lynn and Craig Sandler. It is my pleasure to introduce them to you now. Craig Sandler is a Boston-based journalist and author, and a proud member of the Lexington High School PTO. He owns the State House News Service, an online wire service that covers Massachusetts government in depth and is relied on daily by a majority of the state's political officials, activists, and thought leaders. He's been covering Massachusetts state government and politics since 1988 and is a regular weekend contributor to News Centerfied's Eye Opener. He's the author of the Illustrated Timeline of Inventions, as well as a book about the 1941 baseball season. Co-authored with his father and slated for publication by Bloomsbury later this year. He and his wife, Martha, have one daughter, Lila, a senior at Lexington High School. Christina Lynn is racialized as Asian American and her pronouns are she and her. She's a parent of an LHS graduate and a current LHS student. She has a bachelor's degree in biochemistry from the University of Colorado, Boulder. After working in biotech, she has since shifted her interest to community building, public education, identity, and understanding impacts of racializing culture. Currently, Christina serves as the clerk of the Town of Lexington Human Rights Committee. Welcome, Christina and Craig. I will now pass the mic to Christina to introduce our special guest this evening.
Thank you so much. I just realized my bio, I'm not in public education. I'm just interested in public education. So I needed to make that correction there. So thank you all for coming tonight. We are so excited to have Natasha Warikoo with us tonight. So let me just read her bio real quick. Natasha Warikoo is the Lenore Stern Professor in the Humanities and Social Studies Department of Sociology at Tufts University. Can you hear that? Okay. Oh, closer. Okay. I can hear myself now. A former Guggenheim Fellow, Warikoo studies racial and ethnic inequality in education. In addition to Race at the Top, Asian Americans and Whites in Pursuit of the American Dream in Suburban Schools, she is the author of Is Affirmative Action Fair? The Myth of Equity in College Admissions, released earlier this fall in October of 22. Warikoo is co-chair of Scholars Strategy Network Boston, which aims to connect scholars, policymakers, and community leaders to affect change. And she has earned her bachelor's in mathematics and philosophy at Brown University and her doctorate in sociology at Harvard University. And she's also a former high school teacher. So thank you, welcome. And I think I'm passing this back to you, Greg.
That's right. So we thought that on the infinitesimal chance that someone was arriving at this event without having read the whole book or the book, the best way to quickly get to know a book is to read the blurb on the jacket. So if you'll bear with me for a minute or two, I'm going to do that just so that we get a grounding into what this book and the phenomenon around it is all about. And say it's a wonderful blurb. It's a really good book guide. In any case, the American suburb conjures an image of picturesque privilege, manicured lawns, quiet streets, and, most important to parents, high-quality schools. These elite enclaves are also historically white allowing many white Americans to safeguard their privileges by using public schools to help their children enter top colleges. That's changing, however, as Asian American professionals increasingly move into wealthy suburban areas to give their kids that same leg up for their college applications and future careers. As Natasha Warikoo, thank you very much. Warikoo shows in Race at the Top, white and Asian parents alike will do anything to help their children get to the top of the achievement pile. She takes us into the affluent suburban East Coast school she calls Woodcrest High, with a student body about 1/2 white and 1/3 Asian American. As increasing numbers of Woodcrest's Asian American students earn star pupil status, many whites feel displaced from the top of the academic hierarchy, and frustrations grow. To maintain their children's edge, some white parents complain to the school that schoolwork has become too rigorous. They also emphasize excellence in extracurriculars like sports and theater, which maintains their children's advantage. Warikoo reveals how, even when they are bested, white families in Woodcrest work to change the rules in their favor so they can remain the winners of the meritocracy game. Along the way, Warikoo explores urgent issues of racial and economic inequality that play out in affluent American suburban high schools. Caught in a race for power and privilege at the very top of society, what families in towns like Woodcrest fail to see is that everyone in their race is getting a medal. The children who actually lose are the ones living beyond their town's boundaries. Okay, so that is big, that's a lot. And one question on my mind, probably everyone's mind, is where did it start? Where did it start in your mind? Was it a burning question? Did it start as research? Was it always going to be a book? How did this come to be and how did it grow?
Yeah, great question. So first, let me just say thank you to the folks at Cary Library and the PTO for inviting me here, and all of you, of course, and all of you on Zoom for coming to this event. I always cringe a little bit when I read the book blurbs are not written by authors. Let me just say my style is a little more measured, and I had forgotten the tone of that enough. I always like telling the publisher, can you please tone that down a little bit? But anyway, they want to sell copies, so that's what they do. So how did this book start? So I'm interested in racial, ethnic, and equality in education. As Christina mentioned, I am a former. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I'm a former teacher. And, probably about a decade ago, I started really thinking about inequality in not just, we tend to always think of inequality in terms of disadvantage, but of course, without advantage, there's no disadvantage. And this was the time of like Occupy Wall Street. And I really started thinking about how privilege too can perpetuate inequality. And that led me to a study of students on elite college campuses and how they think about race and meritocracy. I started talking to students on Ivy League campuses out on the Oxford campus about things like, how do you explain the underrepresentation of working class students, of Black students? What's the university's role? Is this a fair system? Should the university do anything about it? So I was really interested in these questions of, for people who are the quote unquote winners, how do they explain inequality and what should be done about it, right? And these students are going to go on to become the leaders of our society, and that led to my book, The Diversity Bargain. As that project, wound down and I was giving talks about it, I would inevitably get this question, well, what about Asian Americans? And I did interview some Asian Americans for that project, but it wasn't a big focus. And so that was sort of in the back of my mind. And then, so this project's probably been almost 10 years that I started thinking about it, and kind of grew out of that. And then also two trends that we're seeing in the United States. The first is that the explosion of the Asian American population. I mean, Asian Americans have been in the United States for over a century, but the Asian American population has doubled in the last 2 decades. So we really see that the country, in terms of being Asian American, is a very different experience today than it was then, when many of the people who are Asian American, if you grew up in the United States, than it was when we were growing up. And that has, so that there's that, and then there was also say in the past decade, and this has been going on for many years, but I think again, rising kind of to the forefront a lot, these questions of Asian American achievement, right? So, more news stories about how, the finalists for the National Spelling Bee are all, or almost all, Indian. Guess what? Now Asian American average SAT scores are higher than whites' average SAT scores. And then there was the Harvard lawsuit, right? Where, there have been all of these anti-affirmative action lawsuits happening, again, for decades. But for the first time, this lawsuit that's now in the Supreme Court has Asian Americans front and center as the plaintiffs. And we'll see what happens with that. So there were these two trends happening, these kind of growing kind of questions about Asian American achievement and the kind of explosion of the Asian American population. So I really wanted to understand, well, what happens when you have a minority group that seems to be in one domain, in academic achievement, not all across the board, but in that domain seems to be not only achieving parity with like the majority group, with whites or upper middle class whites, but actually surpassing. And again, on average, of course, there's a huge range of Asian Americans, and Asian Americans in across all racial groups have actually the biggest range of incomes, of education levels. So I always try to remind people of that we're talking about a very specific group of Asian Americans that is driven by US immigration policy. And so, I'm a qualitative researcher, so I wanted to answer this question by going into a community. So I started looking around the country, and there are communities like this all around the country, including your own, where you have, again, a large and growing Asian American population in a high-income community, and a place where, as you probably likely know, many people move for kind of high-quality education, lifestyle, etc. And that's kind of what led me to this town, Woodcrest, that I sort of really tried to dig in to look qualitatively when we have these trends, what happens? That was a long-winded answer, I realize.
Terrific. That's what we wanted to hear.
Okay, so now it's my turn. And we're just gonna have you like getting a little dizzy tonight. So I think you set me up very well for this question, because really what I would wanna ask you about is, you talk about, coming to Woodcrest and really starting to notice this underlying tension. So could you just talk a little bit more about that tension that you noticed, and maybe also like what you saw was as driving factors of that kind of tension?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think, I saw two things. On the one hand, Woodcrest is an incredibly diverse place, and a lot of people very much appreciate that diversity. Appreciate being in a place where people are coming from a lot of different cultures. And on the other hand, especially when I talk to parents, I think less so than when I talk to kids, or less, I noticed less of this in my observations at school, but there was just some kind of beneath the surface tension around what does it mean to be a good parent? I think we live in an age of where there's a lot of pressure on parents in a way that there wasn't, I think, again, when we were children, right? I mean, if you think back to your own child, I know all parents are different, right? But, this sense of needing to do everything for our children and everything having to be perfect and really needing to be involved in a way that just wasn't the case, say, a generation ago. So I think parenting has changed. And with that, an immense pressure to sort of do things the right way. And I think because of that, we feel very anxious about, and there's a lot of sense of precarity, economic precarity, even among the upper middle class. The sense of, the economy is shrinking, the United States is declining, are my children going to be able to have the same lifestyle as me? And so, then there's this, in a town like Woodcrest, a lot of competition, a lot of very high achievers. And so, in the sense of what do I need to do to get my child ahead? And, I think that the families tended to have different kind of what I call cultural repertoires, that is ways of helping their children get ahead. And so some of the Asian parents who were immigrants mostly from India and China, and they, because of the education systems in India and China, these were people who were professionals, and for most of them, what brought them to the United States was high achievement in their country of origin. And so they came to the United States either for graduate school or through a highly skilled visa, which meant that they did quite well in, again, India and China. So now, most people in India and China do not have a bachelor's degree, let alone a bachelor's degree from a very high status university. But in fact, in this town, a lot of the parents did, because that's how they landed there. And so their whole, what I call way of getting ahead, cultural repertoire, was focused on academics, because in those countries, as in actually most countries in the world, the way you get ahead is through a standardized test, right? The national exam. And what you get on the national exam determines where you can go to college. First, which high school can you go to, and then where you're going to go to college, and what subject can you study. And that's like, colleges don't care about teacher recommendations or sports or any of these other things. Or if they pay attention, it's a very small, very, very small factor. And so those parents brought that, those cultural repertoires to Woodcrest, and that's what they did. They focused on academics, and, they told, there were parents who told me, I told my son, quit the swim team, you're not getting your homework done. And sometimes the kids listened, sometimes they didn't. But there was this idea that academics come first, and you take as many high-level courses as you can. And the extracurriculars, if you need to let go of them, you do. Whereas the white parents had a little bit of a different perspective, I think in part because college admissions is different in the United States. A lot of the white parents use this, I heard this word balance a lot. I want my child to have balance, right? And some of the white parents said things to me like, we told our kids, you can only take one AP class every year because you are, you're really into theater, or you're doing 2 varsity sports this year. You need to make time for that. We don't want you overloaded. So all the parents were concerned about, like, I don't want you to have to take on more than you can handle, but what you give up was different. And so they had these different ways of doing parenting, but that led to some tension, right? So, some of the white parents were frustrated that a lot of the Asian immigrant parents were sending their children to extracurricular math classes, like Kumon and these kinds of things. And that made it hard to get into the honors math classes, because now if a lot of kids are sort of way advanced, then that's where you have to be if you want to be in honors, right? And they were like, well, we shouldn't have to do that to be in honors, right? Now my child doesn't feel quote unquote smart. Whereas some of the Asian parents were like, yeah, that's true, but my kid can't get onto the varsity baseball team because he hasn't played since he was 3 and doesn't play club. And club is this private sports where you have a professional coach, and it's year round, and it's a whole other level, right? And so they, again, different priorities, different ways of doing things, but there was this, it wasn't just okay, we do different things, that's all good. There was a little bit of a tension around that, and right, is that fair? Is it fair that you're sending your kid to club baseball, and that's really expensive, and that's what I can't, my kid can't do, or is it fair that all these kids are going to, Kumon, and now my kid can't be in honors? And so it was some of these tensions that I think that really arose in this.
Can I just add for clarity? So, but these are cultural repertoires for supporting the child in accessing getting into college, right? This is just to be clear, it's not just for a happy life. Ultimately.
Well, it's interesting because I talk about this in the book, how college admissions is sort of the backdrop to all of this, and that's kind of what I was interested in, because I wrote this book about college students, and I thought, well, let me catch students before they've actually gone to college. But they, it is the sort of, parents aren't saying, and I don't think they were always thinking okay, my kid has to do this to get into college. But it was just the sort of their understanding of what it takes to get ahead. So of course, a lot of the Asian immigrant parents, most of them probably understood that in the United States, college admissions is different. But it's just, this was it's a repertoire, it's a routine. It's that's their strategy for getting ahead. Whereas the white parents had a different strategy. And, to be honest, I also think that it gets internalized, right? So it's, if you ask those parents, they wouldn't say it's only for college admissions. I think they would say this is what it means to be an educated person, or this is what you should do. This is what it means to be a good parent. It's you push your kid to achieve the highest academic level they can, or you push your child to find an extracurricular that they're passionate about, and you really support that, or a sport or something like that. So I think they are also, we internalize that achievement system. It's also not a coincidence that, you know, the immigrant parents' repertoires are aligned with college admissions in their country, and the white parents, the repertoires are aligned with college admissions in the United States. I don't think that's a coincidence. But I also don't think that it's a conscious, like, you know, I'm doing this just for college admissions. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm gonna pass it back to Clint.
Well, I thought cultural repertoire is an incredibly helpful term and concept to carry around, particularly in living in a town where there is in fact an observable schism between how people, the values that people bring to this enterprise of education. So thank you for the term. And what was the word that you used? Precarity?
Economic precarity, yeah.
Precarity, that's a good one. We'll take that away from tonight, and thank you. Precarity. There is another term that I want to follow up on from the book, and it's intensive parenting.
Yeah.
Comes up a lot. I took away from the book that it is not really a good thing. It's well-meaning. We're all anxious. We all want our kids to be happy and thrive and make us proud too. But can you then pursue the term intensive parenting and tell us what its implications are? And in fact, how did it come to be? You probably you didn't know the term before you began your research. So tell us about intensive parenting.
Yeah, great. I'm gonna take a step back and talk for a second about cultural repertoires and values, and then go to intensive parenting. So I'm always, it's very gratifying to hear you say that term, because it's a sociological term. I'm a sociologist, and you know, I always hesitate to use like the academic word language, but I felt like it really was an important phrase. So I'm so happy to hear that. And in fact, you know, the idea of cultural repertoires was developed in a way to move away from this idea of values, because I think when we think about values, we often express very similar values, right? You know, when I ask parents, what do you want for your children? When you think about success 10 years from now, what does that look like for your child? You know, there weren't a lot of differences. I want my child to be happy. I want them to have good relationships. I want them to be able to support themselves. Like, they were not super, super high. It wasn't like, you know, I want my child to be CEO or, you know, I mean, that would be nice too, I'm sure, but like no one's, I mean, and again, this is what people said, right? But you know, they care, I didn't even ask this question because I feel like I would know the answer. You know, how much do you care about education? And there are surveys of parents across racial lines, national surveys that look at these questions, and we don't see a lot of differences in terms of, is education important to you? Do you want your child to go to college? Do you believe that they're going to go to college? Across class and racial lines, we see similarities. So the question becomes, why do people behave differently? But we do things differently. Yes. And I think so we want the same things, but we do, and you know, we want them to get into a good college, right? All parents want that. You know, working class parents, all parents want that. But how do we go about doing that? What tools do we have? What knowledge do we have? What kind of habits do we have to do that? I think that is where we see differences. So that's the kind of cultural repertoire. And we can think about cultural repertoires in, you know, other kinds of places as well. So anyway, so I just wanted to follow up on that. But intensive parenting is this idea. So one thing I noticed as I was thinking about this project is that there's a stereotype of kind of white upper middle class, usually moms, which is that this helicopter mom, right? That like super engaged and hyper focused on getting their child ahead. And then there's a parallel stereotype of Asian moms, right? The kind of tiger mom, right? Again, like super involved, getting their kid ahead, making their kid a little crazy. And they're both kind of stereotypes, right? They're kind of caricatures of a phenomena. But this idea, but I think the sort of, you know, I think not many people fit those. I mean, look, there are people who are like extreme, like of all groups, right? So I'm sure there are some people who fit those stereotypes. But for the most part,
Terrific point right there.
That sounds like a child missing a parent. And so, but this idea that we have these, in the contemporary period, particularly among the upper middle class, there's this idea that we really need to focus on our child's achievement and our child's needs and, you know, their well-being and them getting ahead at all costs, right?
Yeah.
And I think there is something, again, to that. I think that runs across racial lines. I think it is an upper middle class phenomenon because you need to be upper middle class to be able to have the time and resources to put into intensive parenting.
Yeah.
Even if you want to be doing that, you're not able to in the same ways.
Now, of course, you were coming to this as a parent, right? With your own cultural repertoire. And that must have gotten, first of all, it must have gotten tangled up in your work and the development of the research and the book.
Yeah.
How did you keep it or try to keep it untangled? And you talk about it in the book, and you know, we sort of see you say, well, I came from this direction, but you describe it, please. And also, though, I want to follow up with more from you about how you kept it untangled and what you learned, what your own research taught you about being a parent, and perhaps grappling with some of the issues that you're hoping to counsel us on too.
Yeah, it's great. So, I mean, there's so many things about, my parents are from India. I was born and grew up in the United States. And so I think this is not why I did this research, but I think in a way it gave me this vantage point that felt very helpful. And I'll just tell you, one anecdote. Like the beginning of this research, I was like, oh, I was interviewing Asian American parents, and I was like, oh, there are differences between, I'm noticing differences between the US born Asian Americans and the immigrant Asian Americans. And I was like, I of all people should have like thought about that in my research design. And of course, I'm a very different parent than my own parents, and I am my father's daughter and my mother's daughter. I have many similarities. So I think it helped me, have empathy, I think, for all of these perspectives, right? I think because I shared some perspectives in common with all of the parents that I met, so that was helpful. And I also feel anxious about my own parenting. I am part of the culture of, the parents that I was talking to, and so I share this story in the book about how I came home from a research trip one night, and I was like, oh my God, my kids need to go to like Russian math or Kumon or something. There's one around the corner from me called, what's an A in it? Anyway, I was like, this is crazy. I can't believe I'm not doing this. Yeah. Even me in my small town in Pennsylvania, like 30 years ago, my parents, my dad would get me these workbooks and I had to do it in the summer. I'm not doing any of that. And so I go and I look up Russian math classes, and I'm like, oh my God, they're 2 hours every week plus homework. And then here's my American side. I was like, first of all, I don't know that I can convince my children to go to this without a big fight. Second of all, is this what I want from, like and then I was like, I can't deal with this. And then I dropped it. So they never went. But I did have that moment of anxiety of like, oh my God, all these kids are doing this and my kids are not. What's gonna happen? Right? And of course, nothing's gonna happen. They're fine. They're doing great, right? They're now a few years older, and they're still passing their math classes. And so I think that some of that anxiety about like hearing and seeing what other families were doing could be kind of anxiety provoking for me. On the other hand, I met a lot of families and kids that were just really inspiring. Like I remember meeting this parent who was like, I just want my children, when they grow up, because I asked them about their aspirations, I want them to have good relationships. I want them to fall in love with someone who's a really good person. And I was like, oh, that totally makes sense. And I think about that all the time when I think about like my young, like nieces and nephews in their 20s, about how like that really matters. And that probably matters more than like, you go to college. So, I feel like I got many like life lessons. It was not a goal of this research, but I also got that. And so, it was couldn't pull myself apart from the research because I am also a parent.
Yeah, that's great. And it's one of the best parts of the book. The best aspects of the book really is that you ultimately bring a lot of love and empathy, you know, to your parents, to the people involved in the book. And you don't necessarily open this book expecting that because, like,
Because of the back
cover. Right, exactly, because of the sensational word. But no, it really, it does proceed from the book that you see both sides and really do bring a lot of empathy and as I say, you know, sort of understanding, caring to these people struggling with these really difficult, you know, what feels like very high stakes issues.
Okay, so I'm going to, I do want to just echo Craig's point that, you know, in the book, it's really grounding the way you sort of talk about how hard it is to be a parent and all the pressures on parenting. And that said, you know, you've mentioned this a few times earlier, talking about being a good parent, getting ahead, you know, and what does that mean? Because when somebody's getting ahead, you know, then somebody's not getting ahead, right? So I wanted to touch on a point you make on page 109. It says, you write, American meritocracy was designed to help upper middle class whites. And also you talk a bit about how that, can I call it gatekeeping? Okay, so that gatekeeping also adjusts depending on the pressures, right? And so you find some really interesting, you make some interesting observations about, you know, what might be new pressures on gatekeeping in this town of Woodcrest, what might be some adjustments to it. But I also wanted to, I'm trying to like wrap 5 questions into one, so that's why I'm rambling now. I do want to just talk about, really, can you first start just with explaining a bit about what you mean by American meritocracy?
Yeah, great. So this idea of meritocracy, you know, just at a basic level, is rewarding people for some kind of socially desired quality, right? So we can think about college admissions as a meritocracy. We can think about like hiring as a merit. We like to think that, you know, if any of you, you know, you like hire in your place of employment, you do it in a meritocratic way, right? You select, quote unquote, the best person for the job. And of course, what those qualities are varies from time to time and according to what the thing is, right? So a job as, I don't know, a construction worker, you probably need a little bit of muscle, right? Or like professional soccer player, you gotta like have some skill, also need muscle. Whereas, you know, a programmer, you need different skills, you need programming skills. And so, and for college admissions, we can think about what gets rewarded. And it's pretty clear, and when we think about particularly college admissions, that historically, college admissions has rewarded elites, right? So if we go back 100 years, there's a great book if you're interested in this called The Chosen by Jerome Karabel, where he looks at, it's a history of college admissions at Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. And all of these elite colleges basically are on the same model. They're all doing very similar things. And so those colleges, you know, way in the past used to use things like, you know, you'd have like a Latin test to determine whether you could go to those colleges. And of course, Latin was only taught at like the Northeast private schools, right? So obviously, if you didn't go to one of those schools, you were not going to any of those colleges. And then they said, okay, you know, we're going to do a standardized test because we want to like, we want it to be more quote unquote meritocratic. So they give these tests, and that's how they're doing it for a while. And then Jewish young men start to figure out how to do well on these tests. And then the elites, all the like, are like, oh no, this is, you know, Jewish men, and of course it's only men, right? Men are not supposed to be the winners. You know, WASPA men are supposed to be the winners. So they change college admissions. They say, okay, no, now we want to get letters of recommendation. Send us your picture. We need an essay, you know, are you good at sports, right? This holistic admissions, it started out as a mechanism of anti-Semitism. So, you know, they changed the game in order to get the outcome that they want.
Which is keeping people out, depending on who they want to keep out.
Absolutely. And so, you know, in the 1960s, that holistic admissions then gets used in a positive way. They're like, oh, you know, we look really bad. We don't admit, we meet almost zero African Americans. Civil rights movement is really getting underway. So they're like, we're going to now consider race in our holistic process, right? Now, though a lot of us may think that that's a positive thing, and as I certainly do. But again, it's like, okay, now we look bad because we exclude African Americans. Let's change the meritocracy. Again, that's a positive change in my mind, don't get me wrong. But the point is that elites use these systems of meritocracy to justify who gets rewarded, right? And so I think that's what I meant in that. And, you know, I saw some kind of, you know, tensions around this in this community where, you know, there were tensions around, you know, should we limit how many AP classes kids can take per year? Should we, the district had stopped publishing a valedictorian or class rank. And a lot of private schools do this as well. They don't publish class rank. And in part, it's because, I don't know what the cause of it is, but you can see how that sort of, again, I don't think it's a deliberate, like, oh, like Asian kids are doing better, so like that's not like highlight that. I don't think that it's as explicit as that, but I also don't think it's a coincidence. So I think we see some of these things where it's like, oh, well, that's not the right way to do it, right? Even if you are getting ahead. So, you know, one thing that I talk in the book, you know, I study immigration and immigrant quote unquote assimilation. One of the theories is that, well, you know, one possibility is that if an immigrant group actually is like doing better than the dominant group, maybe like the dominant group will copy the immigrant group. Like, oh, well, maybe we should do what they're doing. And it's certainly in Woodcrest, I didn't see that. There was more of a like rejection of what those immigrant parents were doing.
Very good. Yeah, and I just wanted to point out that as the parent of a senior traipsing around and doing college tours and getting exposed to the message that I was not familiar with because I'm old, we're test optional. We don't take tests. We don't particularly consider your test score, so don't worry about that. I accepted that, at face value, and then read the book where it's presented that is likely or could well be driven by Asian scores going through the roof and white administrators pivoting to filter out Asians. Now, I could be misrepresenting that, and you should correct me, but
I don't know if
that
that's
is a moment I had.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question. And again, I think it's often like not an explicit, but I also, I think there's a positive reason for pivoting away from the SAT, which is that it's also tends to exclude and rule out Black and Latinx applicants who tend to do worse on standardized tests. And there's this, so first there was COVID, right? That started, I mean, there have been colleges test optional for many years. There's been this movement, and I think COVID really accelerated that because there was a year or two where you just couldn't. And then I was like, well, let's just try this, right? And so, but I think in the wake of the attack on affirmative action, there's this like, okay, well, what are we doing that is exacerbating racial inequality in who we're admitting, and the SAT is one of those things. But again, I do sometimes think that it's, racial justice activists have been talking about this for years, and why is it so? And so I think it's a good thing, but why is it happening? It might be that it's like, oh wait, the traditional group is not the one on top. Yeah. So again, it can be a good change, but it can be driven by like, the wrong people are now on top. Right. So.
Our moderators have one more question, but before that, Christina would like to invite Eileen to say a few words.
Yes, we You know, I wrote this down and printed it out. And now I feel very disorganized. Yes, here we are. Okay. You'll be so unastonished when you hear what. No. So actually, one of our school committee members, Eileen J, she reached out to us because really she loves the book that you've written. It has so much relevance to our community in Lexington, this Woodcrest community. And so she has some ideas, and we just want to give her an opportunity to share that.
Thank you, Christina. I'm Eileen J. I'm a member of the school committee and have been interested in the dynamics that Natasha talks about in this book for many, many years. I am so grateful to Natasha for writing this. And as Christina says, it has very much relevance to our own community. And we are fortunate to have Natasha here today to kind of kick off this conversation. But I think the issues that are raised in this book are so important and complex that we need to continue this conversation. So I am going to try to pull together a group of people within the community to design some kind of follow-up to this author talk. It won't be the PTO and the Cary Library who have generously sponsored this event, but we would like to keep this conversation going. Don't really know what the format will be yet, but we have a sign-up sheet going around for anyone who would just like to be notified of future follow-up events to this book. So please keep that going. If anyone wants to also help doing organizing, please note that on the sign-up sheet. For those of you who are tuning in tonight virtually, the moderators will put a link to a Google form in the chat so that you can sign up to be notified of future events as well. So thank you once again for the moment we took for this, and let's keep this going.
That's fabulous.
Thank you. We also just wanted to take a couple more moments just to acknowledge we have some fabulous people behind the scenes, and we didn't want them to escape before being putting the spotlight on them. So there's a special thank you to Catherine Yan. She is our fearless PTO forums leader. She's really the glue that helped us get everything together. So many pieces, coordinating between ourselves and Maxima and the Cary Library. So, and also kudos to Jen Roney. She's always just this, constant guiding wisdom for us. And so she's been a huge help. And also Helen Liu with Cary Library. You are a fantastic programming director. You made it so much easier for us tonight, so thank you very much. And to the high school PTO, sorry, I didn't mean to make that sound, we really do appreciate it. I'm part of it, so.
That's great.
And also to Deepika Sani for really, bringing some awareness to us at the PTO about this. So, okay, now I don't want to be too greedy because I'm sure there are a ton of questions out there. One thing, before, on the last question, you talked about Black students and Latino students, traditionally having lower scores. I just wanted to ask if you could just explain a little bit on what goes, why that is, because it has nothing to do with, innate abilities.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So there's a lot of things that are behind these differences in test scores. So one is just simply economic resources, right? Families having different economic resources to live in different kinds of communities, and that sort of determines the educational opportunities that families have. That's probably the biggest driver of the differences. But it's not the only one. I think another one, when we look at, interestingly, so not to get too wonky, but when you look at differences in test scores, this is not just the SAT, this is the MCAS or what have you, the national exams. the biggest, so what you see among Asian Americans, the biggest gap actually between racial groups is the biggest difference, for Asian Americans is among working class Asian Americans. Working class Asian Americans do quite well, do much better academically than working class children of all racial groups. And so part of the, so I don't think that actually researchers have a very good explanation for that. I don't think it has to do with how much people care about education, again, because when you ask people across racial lines, you get very similar answers. I think part of that difference is, again, coming from a country that is focused on standardized testing, and that is really a focus for how you get ahead and what you do. I also think that, when you think about, I know New York City pretty well because that's where I was a teacher. So New York City has these exam-based high schools. You might have heard of Stuyvesant High School. In Boston, we have Boston Latin School, which is a sort of parallel school. And in New York City, what you see is in the kind of lower middle class or working class neighborhoods in Queens that are Asian American, you see tons of test prep centers everywhere. You can't turn the corner. And there are advertisements in Korean language newspapers, Mandarin language newspapers, Bengali newspapers. So serving much more working class, again, lower middle class communities, there's just the sort of awareness of these exams is much stronger than when you look at working class communities in, say, the Bronx or in certain parts of Brooklyn. And so there is this kind of community knowledge that is different. If anyone has anyone heard the podcast Nice White Parents? That's all about New York City, and I highly recommend that podcast. It's all about like what happens as New York City tries to integrate its schools. And one of the things they do is they interview these kids, and you hear these kids, these Black kids talking about like, I went to this school, I didn't even know that exam. I actually know that exam exists. Sorry, I'm like getting ahead of myself. I had a student at Tufts, Dominican student from the Bronx, and he was like, I didn't even hear about the test for Stuyvesant High School until it was like the end of 8th grade. And this is like a strong student. He studies in Tufts. He's no dummy, right? But like, it's just that the awareness and the knowledge. People around you are not taking the test. They're not going to test prep. And so there are these different levels of cultural, this knowledge and these ethnic resources that are shaping these differences. And I think we have to sort of, understand all of those dimensions to really understand why we see those differences. That's a little bit of it.
Thank you. So this was the last question. We just wanted to ask you a little bit about your next book, the book that was published after this one. It's the one that's called "Is Affirmative Action Fair?" and how did it come out of your work on race and equality?
Yeah. So, I've been writing a lot. Affirmative action, unfortunately, has been in the news a lot in the last few years. And it's it was a weird year in 2022. I had 2 books come out. That's not normal for me. But it was, this editor, kept asking me to write a book about affirmative action. And I was like, it's like a date who you never say yes to, but you never say no to. I never said no to him. And then this Harvard trial started happening, and I was like, all right, I really need to write this book. And so this book is really a primer on affirmative action. So my bag is that, anyway, I brought a copy just to, if people are interested to sort of see the cover. It's very short, but it's really here's this issue, here's here's all the arguments that people have made for affirmative action, against affirmative action. There's a chapter on Asian Americans, and I think that really comes out of this work, like how to think about Asian Americans and affirmative action, which I felt was really important because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings. And I really try to get people to move away from thinking about college admissions as this individualist meritocracy where the best of the best, right? The best 18-year-olds get to go to Harvard. And then the second best, what's the next, I don't know, get to go to these colleges. And that's not how it works. Nor why would we try to, first of all, why would we try to do that? Second of all, that's not what we're doing, right? We should think about colleges as college admissions as about fulfilling kind of the mission of higher education, which is about contributing to society and our democracy and our collective well-being. And how do we best admit students to do that? And I think if we reframe college admissions as that, it helps us think very differently about affirmative action and a whole host of other things, right? And it's not even, I mean, colleges, many of you probably know this. If your parent went to that college, if you are a big donor, if you are recruited, if a coach wants you, like, these are not, these are very subjective. They're very kind of, they're about like what the college needs right now. It's not about like the quote unquote best of the best. And there are so many amazing young people in this country. And there are so few spots at these elite colleges that, like, it's kind of crazy to think about it as this sort of measure of someone's worth, which it's not.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you, Natasha, Craig, and Christina. We're now going to move to the Q&A portion of our program. So again, if you're here with us in person, please raise your hand and my colleague Susan will bring over a microphone. And if you're with us online, you can put your questions into the Q&A.
So I did read the entire book. It was very interesting.
Sorry, could you say that again?
I did read the entire book,
great.
and it was very interesting. I have a question about one of the interviews you had with one of the students. She said that she came to Lexington from a different high school, and that at her other high school, she was the big fish in the little pond, and that when she came here, she was just like every other kid. And my daughter actually has a friend who went to Lexington Public Schools until the end of freshman year, and then they moved to Westwood, and Westwood High is also a very good high school, just not quite at the level of Lexington. And she went into Stanford, and so I had this conversation with my daughter about, like maybe if she had stayed in Lexington, she would not have gone into Stanford. And so my question is, do you have any thoughts about that? Is it actually, are parents taking the wrong track here by coming to a school where half the class is all within a fraction of a percentage point of each other? Sorry about that. And would it be better to stay in the other high school where you are the big fish?
It's a great question. So first, let me just say, if Woodcrest, which is the fictional name of the town in this book, sounds familiar, it's because there are many towns in this country like Woodcrest, including Lexington. So let me just say that, I call the town Woodcrest. But this question, and I heard this, this question of big fish, small pond, versus big pond. I think it's a little bit of a misunderstanding. On the one hand, what I noticed in Woodcrest was that, and maybe this is familiar to you, that parents saw that this was a very high-achieving town, and many of them, if not a majority of them, had moved to this town because of the schools, because they felt that the schools would help their children, achieve their personal best. On the one hand. On the other hand, they would then say, well, if we lived in, Wyoming, my child would have gotten into Stanford, or, and so, in some ways, that negates the previous decision that, like, I want to live in this kind of place because it'll help my kid get ahead. You can't have it both ways. So that's what, I think it's, so, it's true that, Stanford or any of these colleges will only admit a certain number of students from any high school in the country. And yet, living in these kinds of places really provides a lot of advantages. And, students from these kinds of schools are much more likely to go to Stanford than they are if they're, again, I don't know, the admissions rates at these, particular places, but in general, I think you can't think of it in both ways. You can't think of it as like, this is a good place to raise, to help your kid get ahead and get into a good college, and, it disadvantages you, right? Does it advantage you or does it disadvantage you? You can't have, and I think in the end, I remember parents in this town saying things like, well, there's so many smart kids here that it's so hard to get into, and I found it incredibly problematic. There are, many high achieving kids, but there are smart kids everywhere. Like, that just because you live in a wealthy town doesn't mean that the kids are any smarter than they are anywhere else. It depends, I guess it depends on how you define smart, you can't say that you take the same child and they would do the same thing in a different community, right? So, because by definition, we don't think that. Otherwise, we wouldn't move to expensive places.
But I'm gonna combine a couple of questions from the chat that were sort of similar. The first one was as a sort of where do we go from here kind of a question. What can we as a community do to level the playing field for students who may not have a cultural repertoire of intensive parenting? And a sort of related question, how can we help those students and families who may not have knowledge about the college admissions process? And I just want to add that that second question was actually addressed to Christina as our local Lexington expert, so perhaps the two of you together can tag team your answers.
Wait, I didn't pay attention. You're gonna have to repeat that question.
You were done.
What can we as a community do to help families who may not have familiarity with the college admissions process? I think addressed to you because you're from Lexington, and what can we in Lexington do? But to Natasha as a broader answer. Thank you.
Hey, Craig is also from Lexington.
Sorry. Oh, I thought I was also off the clock. Go ahead.
What can we do to help level the playing field?
Well, I also do want to ask Natasha just about the whole issue of who's getting who's getting left behind. Is there anything? It's not just research, and you don't want it to just be research.
Yeah.
What can we do as a community to even move the needle a little bit or incrementally? How can we behave differently? We're all sort of pell-mell down this, right? It's at the top.
Yeah.
And what can we do not to be in such a race?
Yeah. That's a really hard nut to crack. And we were talking earlier, and I towards the end of the book, towards the end of this project, I just kept thinking about, so let me go back. I was a former teacher. I taught in a school of education for 10 years. Like, I am like an education person, but increasingly, I think the answer doesn't lie in schools. It's like housing, like we shouldn't have communities that are so segregated by class and level of education and race, and increasingly by politics, like our political views. Because when we have these kinds of places where you have to have a very high income to be able to afford to live in these places, and the housing laws are designed to prevent, multi-family homes or smaller lot sizes, or, communities like push back against proposals to build mixed income housing. Like, I think those are the kinds of things that we need. We need to be less segregated, particularly by class. And I think a lot of suburbs, there's a great book, if you're interested, that is about Lexington and the Boston suburbs, called Don't Blame Us, Suburban Liberals, and I forgot the rest of the title, but it's all about the way that suburbs were built around here. And this is not just the Boston area, it's a lot of places. But I think it's a broader story than just the Boston area, but it's all about how these communities were designed to keep Black people out, but then definitely to keep working class Black people out, right? And that the legacy of some of those municipal laws continues. And I think that ultimately those are the kinds of things that create the kinds of community, and again, that's a Boston story, and this is like, just a more general, like, creates these kinds of communities where you have this concentration of high levels of education and income that I think can be problematic, right? Where everybody feels like it's so competitive and it's so hard, and those parents are not, doing things the right way, or they're not accepting our immigrant ways. When in reality, it's like, I have this line of where I say, like, it's a race at the top because everybody's getting a medal. And I was like, we've got okay, you didn't get into Stanford. Oh, but you got into Tufts. Like, is that really going to make a difference? Like, and it's not. Like, and I've seen the research. So that's one of the parenting things, like, about my research is I think I'm a little, I don't know, ask my kids this, but I think I'm a little more relaxed about the college admission stuff because I see the data that, if you have two college-educated parents like my kids do, they're gonna be just fine, like it doesn't matter. But I think when we're in these places where so many of the adults have degrees from top universities in China and India and the United States, that seems like the norm. But the norm is that 2/3 of American adults don't have a bachelor's degree. The norm is like, you don't have a bachelor's degree, let alone a degree from a top university. And I think that's problematic. So I don't know, housing, that's my answer.
So if we want to walk the walk, we will change our zoning.
Yeah.
I was thinking the same thing, that, we have a planning board and there's some zoning issues coming up, so. There is a push for mixed, I should know the term, mixed.
Mixed use, yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, so I do have an answer though, to whoever targeted me. And that is, if I knew, I would be a billionaire, I think so. But I'm glad we're able to talk about it tonight, and I'm sure, if we keep this conversation going, we'll get there. Yeah, so that's my non-answer.
So we have time for one last question.
Two?
Microphone's coming around.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your talk. It was really interesting. I'm on hold for the blog at the library. I think you'll be happy to know there are a lot of people ahead of me, but I'm moving up the queue. So you may cover in the book, but I'm very curious about whether or not you talked to any parents in Crest who didn't buy into the race. My kid's a senior, and I've went to an elite college, teach at elite college, and in that elite college thing, I, like you, have seen the data, and I, like you, am pretty relaxed. My kids are gonna be fine. I'm not that worried about it. But I was struck by the fact that I have friends who were like, yeah, it's all BS. I didn't go to an elite college, I did fine. I had a great college experience. I don't want my kid to go to an elite college. I want them to do well, I want them to thrive, but I'm not giving them any money. I think they should, pay their own way. And so we're gonna target one of the many sort of, second tier or whatever, like good but not super elite colleges. And so they're just pushing back on the whole thing, and the kid got in early and is really happy and everything's great, right? And so I'm curious about whether those parent stories or those kids' stories showed up at all in your interviews.
Yeah. So there definitely, I heard there were some white parents. I didn't meet any Asian American parents who had that perspective, but I certainly met some white parents. And there were kids who, I also, white kids who said, well, my dad was often the dads. My dad didn't, blah, blah, blah. My dad was not a great student in high school, but now he's like the CEO, blah, 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 or now he's, whatever. So and I think I think that was also an ethnic difference, because I think the white parents saw multiple pathways to success in a way that some of the Asian American parents couldn't see, or sometimes they were like, that was not their lived experience, or they were like, well, for us as immigrants, we feel precarious as immigrants, and that you have to do all of these things because, we don't have, wealth to pass down to you. We don't have like the connections. You're not gonna get the legacy, like all of these things, whatever. And so they were less likely to see that. Interestingly, these are like degrees. It's not like you're either like total like intensive parent or you're just like, I don't care, like don't go to college, right? There's like a whole range. I was gonna say something about that. It'll come back to me. So the kids, interestingly, some of the parents said to me that like they gave this message to their kids, but I think the kids were often in this environment where there are so many high achievers that parents were like, I just want my kid to chill out, but the kid doesn't chill out. And I think that's like a Woodcrest story, right? And so because you're again surrounded by very high achievers, it's hard to sort of get away from that. But I will say also there's a difference in tracks. Like this high school was very tracked. And so certainly kids who are in the upper tracks felt that even more. And I did I made sure that I talked to kids across achievement levels, and the kids in the lower kind of tracks definitely talked about how it felt very different in those places, and they were less, some of them. So certainly there's variation, and I talk about that in the book as well. Yeah. It's hard to get the the nuance and then still tell the story, and so hopefully you feel like I got it right when you read it.
Thank you. So that's all the time we have this evening. I want to thank Natasha, Craig, and Christina for sharing their thoughts on Natasha's book. Before we all leave though, Catherine, the PICA, and the PTO have a token of appreciation to thank Natasha for coming tonight.
Can you? Oh, yeah, sure. This is for you from the PTO. Oh, thank you. Awesome.
Thank you all for joining us. Come up and meet Natasha. And again, Brian is here from Maximum Book Center in the back. If you are interested in purchasing a book, Natasha is happy to sign a copy of the book for you. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us.